What's up, boys? Doing the first one of these question answering things in a little bit. Finally got some questions off of both YouTube and then a couple off of Instagram on my coaching page. Just because I was running a little low and I wanted to make sure I could do this video. So I asked for some, got a couple questions, got some good ones. I'm going to answer those after I give a brief, or maybe not brief, update on my own training, because a couple of you guys said to continue doing those on the last one. So just kind of where I'm at. Just finished up the end of my last block. I worked up to a max pause squat. 635 was easy, really easy. 655, super clean, super easy, good pause, good depth. 675, got a little bit in my head, and I cut it just slightly high, which is okay. It's a pause squat, not really super upset about it. The pause was there, but because I cut it high, that actually made it a lot harder than it needed to be, because that pitched me forward, turned what could have been a really smooth weight into a bit of a grinder. The next day, I worked up to a max overhead press, on which I hit 340. Reasonably pleased with that. That is an all-time PR over my prior PR of 335. Yeah, nothing to complain about there. Third day, just worked up to a relatively quick 695 on bare hand conventional deadlift. That moved really well, so hoping to be batting for some all-time PRs this coming block, if not the next one, just kind of depending if it continues to click. I've kind of taken note of what I did this block towards the end. I got my deadlift firing on all cylinders. So hopefully I will be able to duplicate it. Obviously, the most important thing is, being adherent to my diet, doing my sleep, training hard. And after those things, the program is secondary, but it does certainly matter at my level. So hopefully I'm smart enough to learn from what I did right and what I did wrong, and we'll be able to duplicate that success. I took my off day, then I started straight into volume on the bench press. Hit some abysmal numbers as far as my sets of 10, just because I'm deconditioned to training for reps, which is to be expected. Totally okay. I think I worked up to some 10s in like the 315 to 365 range. A lot harder than they should be, but I deconditioned, and that's fine. Then I came in, also started into volume on my SSB work, so I worked up to a very easy set of 12 just to start building up my work capacity. I'm going to start pushing the intensity on those higher rep SSB sets next week, just because I kind of added an extra half week onto the volume. Did some pulls against bands, which for some reason I caught a ton of shit for on Instagram, because no one bothered to ask me why I was doing them. And that Joe TSA post is very popular right now about why bands and chains and accommodating resistance isn't a mainstay of powerlifting training in the modern era. It's not great for raw lifting, sure, whatever. Wish somebody would have asked me why I was using them before being like, oh, this dumbass is trying to overload his lockout. Lockout issues are actually that you gave up your position off the floor. Yeah, right? I know that. I'm not dumb. The main reason I use pull against bands sometimes is it gives me like a nice proprioceptive cue that reminds me that the higher up I get in the deadlift, I need to be in a more and more, or I should be in a more and more mechanically advantageous position. So, the higher the height of the bar, the more you should be able to pull if you pull with a relatively neutral back, right? So you can pull more from a block than you can from the floor. You can pull more from the knee than you can from the floor, from the block, and then you can pull more mid-thigh than you can from the knee. Stands to reason that you're just putting yourself in continually more mechanically advantageous positions. And a band just kind of reminds me that I should be entering more like stronger positions through the pull, rather than compromising my technique right off the floor to gain strength, like speed off the floor, at the cost of a harder lockout, right? So it's mostly just a nice little like feel thing that helps me keep my technique honest, which is why I use relatively light bands. Didn't stop people from bullying me in my messages about it, but I'm not too worried about it. What matters to me is that things work, not not that people on Instagram think I'm particularly smart. Kind of finished up that day with just some bodybuilding posterior chain work, just hammered my hamstrings. Nothing too interesting. And then I came in today, I worked up to a 305 strict log just to see if I could. As always, the press was really, really comfortable and easy, and the and the clean was fucking awful. I finally found out why my clean is bad upon review of the video. After I lap it, I pull it into myself. I always thought that I was not strong enough at rowing to keep it pinned to my chest to roll it up, right? Because every time I would go to clean the log, it would slide downward. And I would ask my strongman friends, and they're like, "Oh yeah, you just need to row it into yourself better, pull higher, pull in better." But upon review of the video and then going and looking at some really good strongmen, I realized that during the clean, my heels peel like 3 inches off the floor, which I think is just a sign that I'm losing it forward during the clean phase rather than keeping it the center of mass over my midfoot, like you should do in every lift. So I figured out what I was fucking up. Forever, I couldn't figure out why my clean was so shit. But we're making some progress. So hopefully I'll be able to do like, I don't know, 335 strict, 340 strict, more in lines with my barbell numbers. Because while the log is more cumbersome and easier to lose forward, so it's more difficult than a barbell strict press in that regard, you're starting from a higher height, so it largely cancels out. I find they're roughly equivalently difficult. I find that strict overhead press carries very well to the log, just because of its cumbersome nature. That if you get really efficient at a push press on a bar, it's not necessarily going to carry over all that well to the much more cumbersome log. Whereas if you develop strict strength, generally speaking, if you can press something over your head strict, you're going to be able to do it with leg drive on a log, assuming you're reasonably technically proficient. So kind of brings me into my next block starts next week. Kind of split about what I'm going to work on. I'm going to work on some non-pause squats, just because I pushed the pause squats for a while. My knees are feeling decent. Everything's clicking pretty well. I feel remiss not to work on my squat. Going to work on my SSB squat because that has carried over so insanely well every single block to my squat that I would be a fool not to just keep doing that. Going to try to stay the course on the deadlift because that seems to be trending upward yet again. Pressing is the one I'm really not sure. I don't know whether I should push for a new flat bench PR now that my pec is a little bit healthy. Whether I should continue pushing the strict overhead press, or whether I should work on my log. I'm probably going to try to do a shittier job at all three and see how that goes before I decide which one I want to focus on for a while. So that's kind of the plan. Yeah, getting into the questions. The first one I got on the Instagram was ideal macro percentages for lean muscle gain. Okay, so I'm not the biggest percentage guy. I kind of like the even 30-30-30. So not equal protein, fat, carbs, but equal calories coming from protein, fat, carbs. Obviously, fat has 9 calories per gram, whereas carbs and protein have 4. I hope I don't fuck that up because that would sound dumb, but you have to adjust for that, so it can't just be fat set equal to protein, but equal amounts of energy coming from each is often a really good starting point for most people. That being said, the way I structure macros, and I would recommend people structure macros, is kind of more along the lines of what the RP guys do, which is you set your protein to 1 gram per pound of lean body mass, because based on the research, that's where we see benefit up to. There's a lot of good debate about whether higher level strength athletes and bodybuilders would benefit or can benefit, especially if they're on anabolics, from a greater than 1 gram per pound of body weight, and a lot of very smart guys anecdotally pointing to yes, and the fact that there's no studies even conducted on those subpopulations, right? So we can't just say like, oh, the evidence says there isn't any, right? No, the evidence hasn't looked at it, right? So we have to look to anecdotal experience from smart people. That being said, everyone who watches my videos is pretty gen pop, so I would recommend just going straight to that 1 gram per pound of body weight number. Yeah, I don't know. So I would jump to that. Then I would set your fat to around 0.35 times your body weight in grams, because roughly that's probably the amount of fat that we need for hormonal production. So we want to top out that protein before we see diminishing returns, right? Because that's the building block for muscle. We want to make sure we hit that minimum for fat so that we're not suppressing our own hormonal production. But neither of these macros have indefinite benefit, right? So at some point, going past a certain point on protein is just arbitrary. It's just something to burn through, right? Maybe we get a nice thermic effect out of it, but whatever. At some point, past hormonal production, more and more fat, we don't really get any benefit. Carbs, hypothetically, can have indefinite benefit, right? Because they're anti-catabolic, right? They drive an insulin response, which, is an anabolic process. So hypothetically, because carbs are protein sparing, we can see an indefinite benefit to it. So what we do at that point is we figure out, okay, so we have X grams of protein, we have X grams of fat. I'm going to fill the rest of my daily caloric intake with carbohydrates, however much that is. If you're in a deficit, that might not even be very much, right? Because carbs are the one unnecessary one of the macros. I mean, I guess alcohol is also a macronutrient, but it's not one of the three core ones, and isn't necessary, depending on who you ask. But because carbs aren't necessary, that's where we're going to do our calorie manipulation, right? So if you're in a deficit, you're going to take away some of those carbs, but we're going to maximize that protein. We're going to, make sure we hit that minimum on the fat, and then we, fiddle with the carbs. And so if we're bulking, we drive that up with the carbs again because of the hypothetical indefinite benefit we can get from them, and also because they're more palatable. As far as the lean muscle gain, following these guidelines, the lean part of it just comes down to making sure that you're gaining at a reasonable weight of probably about half a pound per week, maybe 1 pound per week if you find that you're genetically gifted. Any more than that certainly isn't going to be majority muscle. Maybe taking maintenance phases when you're exceeding, call it 13-14% body fat, because of above that, our nutrient partitioning is going to be worse. So it's just put simply, when you're fat, any additional weight that you gain is more likely to be fat than it would be, less likely to be muscle, more likely to be fat than it would be if you were leaner. We're more efficient with our nutrient partitioning, 13% below, 12% below, whatever the number is, right? A lot of people will speculate about that. But basically that just comes down to, if you want to lean gain, you want to be trying to not gain weight at the rate that you couldn't be gaining muscle. We want to create a good demand for our protein intake, train hard, drive progressive overload, intake with the right amount of protein, and just maintain that steady course. Anytime you get overly fat, you probably need to cut back down just a little bit to improve your nutrient partitioning again. The second question was, can you overtrain biceps? Yes, absolutely. I know you're training them really hard right now, Kel. So, it's harder than a lot of people would think, but there's absolutely a certain number of working sets per week where you're overtraining them. You might be able, you're not going to see any good progress. You might actually see some level of regression. If you just killed them every day, for example, just absolutely murdered them, at some point you're not going to grow. You might actually be regressing. That being said, it's definitely a little harder than some people think. You can definitely overtrain them. There's also just some point of severely diminishing returns. So let's just say you're doing 20 sets a week for your biceps. You maybe could crank that up to 30 and not overtrain per se, but you might not see any additional benefit to all that effort. So kind of what's the point in that regard? And then any benefits to training them. Okay, so aside from bigger biceps, I assume you mean maybe from a powerlifting perspective, they do play some level of stabilizing role in the bench press. But that being said, I think you're going to have plenty of strength in the bicep to stabilize the bench press from just bench pressing and any pulling accessories you might be doing. So in that regard, I don't think training them is all that valuable as some kind of strengthening your stabilizers. Just doing a motion will strengthen the stabilizers hypothetically to the exact amount you need. Maybe if you wanted more work, that's where the pulling volume comes in, because no matter how you cue them, you're never going to get your biceps out of a pulling motion. So I guess the one argument you could make, other than the fact that they look good from a powerlifting perspective, is that you're training the muscle and the tendons to be more resilient, because a stronger, more well-prepared muscle, you're probably less likely to have symptoms of tendonitis or tendinopathy. So either proximal or distal. That would be the one benefit, is maybe that you're going to have more resilient biceps by training them. Just like any other muscle group, the one way you can reduce injury risk is to strengthen the tissue. The next question was, progress a little slower while getting leaner, or maintain body weight for quicker progress? That's all goal-oriented, man. If you want to look good, probably cut down. Especially because when you cut down, you're actually going to be more efficient for nutrient partitioning, and on your way back up, you're actually going to gain muscle more than likely better than had you just stayed at the same body weight the whole time and had that worsened nutrient partitioning. That's why a lot of bodybuilders nowadays don't get fat. What they do is they'll, in the off season, they'll bulk until they exceed around 12% body fat, and then they might hit a quick cut phase, or maybe they stay there. because they know that their returns past that point are going to be diminished. So if gaining lean body mass is your goal, that might be a reasonable approach for you. It all depends on your goals. Frankly, if that was me and my goals were purely strength oriented, I might stay at the same body weight and just try to drive body composition change through workload, do some amount of conditioning, really create a big demand for change, a big demand for adaptation via really difficult training. As long as you're not exceeding your ability to recover on a weekly basis, the bigger of a demand you can create for change, as long as you fuel said demand, you're going to drive more body composition change. Try to really clean up the diet a little bit. It kind of depends. I can't give you a really solid answer because to some degree both can work. So it's largely personal preference and which one you think you're going to enjoy more. If you just cut and you really in the back of your head, you're like, fuck, my numbers are going down. I hate this shit. I hate this shit. I hate this shit. The result isn't going to be good. Whether it's just cortisol levels or some kind of self-belief shit. Usually if you hate something and you don't buy into it, it's not going to work quite as well. The next one was tips for confidence on a big lift. I'm a big believer that if you prepared thoroughly enough, you're going to have internalized how hard you worked. If you crossed your T's, dotted your I's, you didn't miss a meal, you've been going to bed early, doing everything to the best of your ability to achieve a goal, I think that when you are confronted with said goal, you're going to have some level of just subconscious confidence that can't be manually duplicated, right? You're going to be like, if I can't do this right now, no one could have done it because I know I couldn't have worked any harder. If you prepared thoroughly enough for a number, it's almost a given in your head that you're going to do it because you're like, I know I did the work for this number. And that's always been my approach is if I don't feel confident going for a number, it probably means I didn't train hard enough, I didn't do enough to be prepared for it, and I haven't earned the right to attempt the weight. I wasn't nailing stuff to the degree that I need to. That's my personal approach, but there's a lot of ways to do it. I can't tell you what's best for each of you because obviously we're all very different people, and that approach might work really well for me, but that might be some hippie mumbo jumbo to you guys. That would be my opinion. And then the questions from the YouTube page. When coming off of a major injury where you lost all work capacity, weights that are 60% feel extremely heavy, would you recommend a bridge block where the main goal is to increase work capacity? So I think it's important to remember that if you're coming off a major injury, 60% isn't 60%. Percentages should be based off of your current max, not your all-time max. All-time numbers, while they provide good references for goals, they don't provide good information for programming, really. So it's not saying like, oh, go test your max, but try to come up with like a realistic appraisal of where you're at currently. See what the gap between where you're at currently and where you were is, and maybe I would design a training block where my goal is to get back to where I was, rather than trying to exceed it on the first block. That's what I've done historically. Is the first block back when my pec was kind of working again. The first thing I wanted to do was I'm just going to dedicate a whole training block to just getting back to where I was, and then the next block I'll be in the green trying to make all-time PRs. You could have a phase dedicated to work capacity. You could just build into a regular block a greater emphasis across the whole block on said work capacity by doing conditioning or any loading protocol that's going to challenge your work capacity a little bit more, like every minute on the minute work, supersets, giant sets, any kind of hit work. It's again, I guess I'm going to give you the same flaky answer as I gave the last question, the question before, where I say it's largely personal preference. Whatever approach you buy into the most, largely is going to be what's going to work best for you. As long as you're crossing your T's and dotting your I's and you're doing everything well, you're not taking dumb numbers, you're keeping your form honest, you're training hard, you're working hard on your accessories. Whatever approach you take to getting back to where you were, as long as you're doing it in like a smart and full of effort manner, it's going to work. So I guess that what matters is what you're going to enjoy, because people tend to work a lot harder on things they're going to enjoy. And I think that that's a hippie mumbo jumbo perspective, but it also just ends up being how things work out more often than not. The next guy says, keep the training updates. Well, it's a good thing I did, I guess. Although I don't think Chad increases sets anymore during a block, just RPE week to week, or at least based on his AI app. Um, okay, yes. So I don't know. I have no idea what Chad does nowadays. All I know was based on, maybe it's even an old iteration of one of his Juggernaut books, one of the Principles of Programming books, back when he was working more closely alongside Mike Isertel. I know that one of the things he talked about was a little bit more in line with Mike's ideas, where you're ramping up the number of working sets across a hypertrophy block rather than necessarily climbing the RPE. But if he's found that's not very practical from a powerlifting perspective since then and changed his approach, that's totally possible. You're probably more in the know than I am. Yeah, I don't know. That would be my opinion. And then he also said, there are also some replies about this, talking about some guy was like, oh, in his book, he might have said that, which makes me at least feel a little bit validated. But yeah, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, if that's what he's doing now, then it's changed at some point. Because I do recall pretty distinctly at some point that's what he was advocating for. Not saying that's what he's doing now. I'm not saying it's best practice. Just kind of, I know for a fact that at some point that was something he was talking about. But I'll take your word that he doesn't do that anymore, or at least it's not part of the Juggernaut AI. And then the last one. Could you discuss Watercut meat week diet protocol for a moderate 5% weight loss? Thanks, bro. Appreciate the vids. Okay, so diet protocol. If we're talking meat week, obviously we're not going to shed any really meaningful amount of fat, and if we did, that'd be a really bad idea, because that'd be a steep caloric deficit to do the week before a meet. So I'm going to recommend, as far as the dietary meat week, we are going to, eat what you normally eat. Eat at caloric maintenance. Eat foods that you're familiar with. You don't want to upset your stomach the meat of the week, like week of the meat or the day of the meat. Trying to do some fancy shit you haven't done before. Don't try to carb load with candy. Carb load with whatever carb you eat the most of on a daily basis, because you know how your body handles it, right? So, not fucking up your digestion on meat day is something that seems pretty basic, but a lot of people don't do. So that'd be the first one. Keep your diet pretty steady. Meat day, meat week, it should all be stuff that you're accustomed to. You should be trying anything that you haven't done many times before, right before a competition. As far as a water cut, man, I'm pretty anti-water cut, if I'm being honest with you. I just don't understand why people are cutting water when there isn't a significant record on the line. If the goal is to increase your total, why would you decrease your likelihood of having the best results you can? Even a minor water cut is enough to throw some people off, and regularly does. Potentially also spiking your risk of injury for some, to get arbitrarily into some lighter weight class where your total frankly isn't good there either. It's maybe a little bit better, maybe your Wilks is a little bit higher, but as far as long-term development, you're not benefiting from that, other than maybe getting the water cutting experience. All right, I'm not supposed to rant about how I don't like water cuts for non-advanced athletes, like really advanced. That's not the question. If I was going to do it, basically you're just going to do a water taper. I recommend against tapering your electrolyte intake super hard. I really don't like that. And I think it has an adverse effect on most people. But you can taper them to a lesser degree. Generally speaking, active means of water loss are going to be better than passive, so we're going to avoid getting in a hot bath unless we absolutely have to. We're preferably going to go put on a sweatsuit and hop on the treadmill. Generally speaking, that's going to lead to less of a detrimental effect to your training based on what I've read. Yeah. And then you're going to have like a rehydration protocol that's going to involve regimented intakes of carbohydrate feedings, some continual amount of liquid intake paired with a proportionate amount of electrolyte intake, and make sure you get a full spectrum of electrolytes. I think a lot of the time people really just boil it down to sodium, when sodium, depending on the person, isn't even the most readily abundant electrolyte in your diet. You actually, at least based on the RDA, you get more potassium. So make sure that you're intaking a full spectrum of electrolytes alongside your water intake proportionally, so that way you aren't just immediately pissing it out. That being said, I'm not a huge expert on weight cuts. I wrote a paper about it in my undergrad, but that doesn't make me an expert at all. But pardon the anti-weight cutting rant. If you guys have any questions for me, put them in the comments of this video, and I will get to them in the next one, hopefully with a little bit less rambling.